Okay, welcome everybody to week 3. Today's lecture is all about population dynamics. So as you might have guessed, we've sort of left behind the more boring stuff of the course that we had to cover at the beginning, the methodologies and the kind of introductory stuff. So at this point in the course, we start to cover some more hopefully interesting things that you guys might find interesting. The way that it'll work is that essentially every week we'll cover a new type of health determinant or a new sort of factor that has impacts on health. So for this particular week, we're covering concepts related to human populations and population trends. So last week, as sort of a refresher, we covered health research methods. We talked a lot about different study designs, particular pros and cons of certain study designs, why we might see some over others that are more commonly used in health geography. And that was really to give you guys a sort of chance to get familiar with some of the stuff that you would need to know for assignment 1. So definitely, if you still have questions about that stuff, let your TAs know, let me know, because we won't be revisiting it so much in the lectures. So if you still have any questions or feel like you maybe didn't get something completely, then let us know. Reach out to us over email or in your tutorials, because we won't really have a chance to cover that kind of stuff in the lectures anymore. But so this week, as I said, we're covering population dynamics, demographic shifts. So that's going to be the focus of today's lecture. And then tomorrow, we'll actually start to talk about how differences in populations might have impacts on disease trends and how diseases might actually have impacts on population trends. So kind of covering both sides of the coin there. Now, what factors do you guys think influence the growth or decline of human populations? And it might help to think of these in sort of societal versus individual factors, so large scale factors versus individual factors. But I want to turn it over to you guys. What do you think? What factors influence human population growth or decline? We've got 1, education. Okay, that's a factor. Birth rate and death rate, migration, free healthcare. Yeah, that could potentially influence populations. If people are getting access to care, drug use, yep. Environmental problems, living environments. Yeah, these are all great ideas. Political state of location. Yeah. So conflict, we will also cover that a little bit in today's lecture. Any other ideas? So I've got a few that I'll pull up. So something like the economy versus personal income, right? So those two different scales might play out very different in terms of their impacts on population trends. Education versus something like individual female employment, the stability of the country versus someone's personal safety of maybe their own neighborhood, maternal health versus something like an individual's access to contraception, immigration. So yeah, you guys covered a lot of these types of factors, and we'll cover some of them in a little bit more detail as we go through this today. So why do we study population dynamics? What's sort of the point of this week's lecture topics? Well, this has to do with the study of demography, which is all about statistics such as births, deaths, some of the things that you guys mentioned, income, the incidences of diseases, and these all illustrate the changing structures of human populations. Now, trends in populations and demographic statistics are really important to know because they tell us about the health of a population, they tell us the health of an economy or the society in general. So how do we know if a population is growing? what specific statistics might we look at? What do you guys think? Population density, economic growth, more births and deaths, fertility rate. Yeah, you guys are on fire. Birth rate. Yeah. So yeah, it depends on births, it depends on deaths, and it of course depends on migration. So these are sort of the three main factors that influence the levels of population growth or decline. Now, this brings us to another sort of important concept, which is population growth rate. Now, that's the annual average rate of change of a population size for some given geographic area during some specified time period. So the growth rate is extremely important to know because it can tell us how quickly that population is growing, because it's not just enough to know whether it's growing or declining, but we also really want to know at what pace it's growing. This will obviously have consequences on planning things like healthcare delivery in a society, as well as planning for jobs and what kind of state of the economy you might have in a given country. So these are important things to know. So when did global population growth rate peak? Well, you can see there the purple line. So it actually peaked in 1968, which I was kind of surprised to see when I was looking up these statistics for the lecture. I kind of assumed that it happened later on, but no, indeed it happened in 1968. And the peak was at about a 2.1% growth rate. Now, this doesn't mean that population has stopped growing, because as you can see, sort of the green part of the figure there, the total population is of course still expanding, but it is growing at a smaller rate. So it's not growing as quickly as it was, particularly back in the 1960s, 1970s. So currently we're at, I forget what the population is today. I looked it up early this morning. Somewhere in the, I think, 7 billions. If someone wants to look it up later, they can. Now, this part of the graph here where you see 7.7, yeah, something like that. So this part of the graph here where you see this lighter green, this is a projection, and that's because demographers are in a bit of conflict here. They don't actually know what's going to happen. Based on their sort of best guesses, it really depends on what happens on the continent of Africa. Now, this is because a lot of the nations there are still sort of experiencing exponential population growth rate, but the question is how quickly that might stop. So how quickly some of their economies might transition to more of the types of economies that we're used to, these sort of industrialized, slower growth. And that does translate into consequences on population growth, as we'll talk about today. So that's sort of the reason why we don't really know what's going to happen in the future. There's sort of this big question mark, particularly with Africa. Now, what did things look like even further back? So before the sort of 1700s from the last figure. Well, as you can see, human population growth is really a recent phenomena in terms of human history. So if you go before that, sort of before the 14th century, population was pretty small. It never really got above that sort of 500 million mark. We didn't surpass that point until after the sort of last big pandemic, the Black Death, which killed a significant portion of the human population. So things didn't really take off until, the 1700s, when we started to experience this really intense exponential growth. So how do we characterize populations? So these are some important definitions to know. And you guys actually mentioned a couple of these earlier. So population density came up, which is the number of people per unit area, such as per square kilometer. Then we've got population distribution, and that's just how the people are actually organized over a geographic area. So how frequently they might be located in one particular area versus another. And the population structure. So that's the characteristics of people in some given area. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about that today. But population structures can be thought of as structured by gender, for example, males, females, by age, which is what we'll mostly cover today, and then socioeconomic status as well. So by income group, for example. But we won't really cover the income stuff until later in the term. So this brings us to this concept of population pyramids, which I'm sure many of you have seen at some point before, especially if any of you took any sort of high school geography courses back in the day. But to refresh your memory, in case any of you have forgotten, population pyramids are a really important geographic sort of tool because they help us assess the population structure of a particular, usually nation that we're looking at. And you can glean a lot of important information just by looking at this population pyramid. So you can know the extent of economic development in a particular country, right? You can know how the society is likely to structure based on the proportions of males and females as well. And many other aspects of the population can tell you just about general population trends when you look at these pyramids. So that's why we'll be covering them in quite a bit of detail today. So the first type of population pyramid is this expansive population pyramid. So you might notice its sort of noteworthy characteristic is the really large base at the bottom of the pyramid. So it tells us that there is a high fertility rate in that particular country. And it tells us that there's going to be a experience of rapid growth, so rapid population growth because of this really large base at the bottom of the pyramid. So because of that, we know that the children that are being born here, as they age, the sort of levels of the pyramid will continue to expand and the population, the total population will grow at a very rapid rate. This is important to know, obviously, because it can help with the planning of things like childhood education. If you know that a country is experiencing a huge boom in particularly school-aged children, then you obviously want to know that. You want to plan for that and make sure that there are adequate resources to actually help those children. And of course, infant mortality plays into this. So there's many reasons why you might see a population pyramid like this, why many families might want to have larger families. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So the next sort of type of population pyramid is what's called a stationary pyramid. Now, you'll notice the characteristic of this pyramid is that you see these really equal proportions per age group. So the proportions of the population in each age grouping is about equal. Now, this is important because it tells us that there's very little growth. In fact, the population will kind of expand at a very slow and steady pace because of these equal proportions. Now, it also tells us that most likely the life expectancy is high, certainly much higher than what we saw in this pyramid, right? Where not as many people were reaching that older age group. So in this pyramid, by contrast, you're starting to see life expectancy expand and more people are surviving into these later ages. So the next one here is the constrictive population pyramid. Now, in contrast to the other two, what's sort of noteworthy about this one is that you really want to pay attention to the working age trends, because that's where sort of the differences emerge, where different proportions of the population might be spread out differently. So in this particular example, you might notice that there's a huge sort of amount of younger adult groups compared to relative to the older ages. And so that might be interesting for someone who's studying population trends in a particular country to note that these people are going to be entering the workforce and they want to make sure that there's enough economic opportunity in the country to adequately support these people. Now, what else does it tell us is that there's likely no growth happening, or if it is, it's at a very slow and steady pace, similar to the stationary population pyramid. And we can tell that just by here that there's a very small proportion of the population in these very young age demographic groups. Now, another thing that's really interesting to note from these types of population pyramids is to specifically look at the trends by gender, right? So by male, female. What do you guys note for this particular population pyramid? Why is this a sort of interesting example? And I'll tell you in a moment where this is. There's more females, yeah. Anything else noteworthy? Where specifically are they? Thanks, Regina. See you later.
See you, everyone.
So where do we see this larger proportion of females? Is it equal across the age demographics, especially between 20 and 60-ish? Yeah, so again, sort of looking at those working age trends. Now, this population pyramid is Hong Kong. So it's interesting to note because in a place like Hong Kong, life expectancy is fairly high. So you do see some proportion of the population reaching these sort of older age categories. But what's going on here with the females? Why are there so many more females? Well, as Hong Kong and China increasingly developed sort of friendlier ties, friendlier relations, many educated women from mainland China actually migrated to Hong Kong for better economic opportunities. Another interesting sort of thing that happened in Hong Kong is that many of the sort of upper class families in Hong Kong commonly hire help at home. So whether that's cleaning personnel, or so on and so forth. And many of those tend to be females. So demographers think that that's what's going on in Hong Kong, that there's a reason for this sort of influx of females appearing in Hong Kong, that it's likely due to both migration as well as some kind of economic migration, specifically hiring workers that tend to be more of the female dominant type. So due to this skew, what's sort of interesting is that demographers think that 1 in 5 women in Hong Kong will end up single because there's this sort of shortage of men. So it's maybe a bit of a concern for women who live in Hong Kong and who might find themselves sort of in a bit of a pickle looking for another mate, especially if they are in a heterosexual couple. So that's something that we can learn from population pyramids. Now, another really sort of important, but a bit of a depressing thing that you can learn from population pyramids is specifically the impact that diseases or famines or wars take on a population. So looking at their impact there. This particular population pyramid is for Botswana in Africa. And it shows us what the population pyramid would have looked like. So that's here in the white, what it would have looked like without the effect of AIDS. In reality, what we actually see is this colored population pyramid here. So the blues for the males and the reds for the females. And so what's noteworthy? Well, we know that HIV/AIDS has a huge, huge impact on life expectancy. So that's the main reason why we see a huge sort of shortage or this gap of older age individuals as you go from sort of middle age up. People, unfortunately, are just not living long enough to reach those age groups. And it, of course, affects infant mortality, right? If there's less people sort of in these ages to have children, then that will also impact the number of children that can be born. So we can learn a lot of useful, sometimes kind of depressing things from these population pyramids, the information that they tell us. Now, can population pyramids predict future trends in population dynamics based on what we've just been seeing? What do you guys think? Yes. Does anyone want to venture a guess for how they might help us predict future trends? So what sort of things were we looking at when we were looking at those population pyramids? What parts of the pyramid were we looking at when we wanted to try to figure out trends? The number of newborns, yep. The young population, life expectancy. Yeah, exactly. So you guys got it. The ratio of people in reproductive years. So let's take a look at an interesting country. This is Italy's population pyramid. First off, does anyone want to remind us what kind of population pyramid this is? What would we call this? Constrictive, yeah. So we know it's not expansive. That was the sort of broad-based. We know it's not stationary because the categories aren't equal. So this is a constrictive type. Now, based on that, why do you guys think demographers are concerned when looking at this population pyramid? What does it tell us? Lowering birth rate, yeah. Population decline, yeah. And there won't be enough young people to replace the working class. Yeah, exactly. So that's sort of the main concern for demographers who are taking a look at what's going on in Italy. They're particularly interested in what's going to happen once these sort of baby boom aged individuals end up retiring. There's going to be this sort of shortage of labor, of workers who can fill up these jobs because there's not as many people born to replace them. So increasingly, demographers are looking at sort of creative ways to try to entice people to have children, but also to entice occasionally migration to happen so that enough people are replenishing this declining population. Now, what happens with migration? How much of a role does migration play in shifting population dynamics? Well, as you can guess, it might depend on where you live. So we're going to take a quick look here at Syria and some of the trends that have been happening over the last decade or so. So back in 2010, Syria had a total population of about 21 million. And as you can see, the bottom of the population pyramid was particularly large. So what kind of pyramid was this? What was this an example of? Expansive, yeah. Yep. So it was expansive, which means that they had a really high fertility rate, right? You can see that here with the 6-7%. So lots of babies were being born and the population was growing at a pretty exponential rate. Now, what happened in Syria after that? Does anyone want to remind us? War, yes. So civil war broke out in 2011. So let's take a look at what impacts that had on the population there. Interesting. So suddenly we see the base of the pyramid here, quite a bit smaller than it was, right? Fertility rates dropped, less babies were being born. Now, this is obviously partially due to people migrating out of the country, right? Bringing their young children with them, but also of the people who remained, many of them were probably not thinking about having children during a period of intense conflict. So that would certainly explain the drop in fertility rates, the drop in the people or the younger aged people in the base of the pyramid. And what's also noteworthy is here this total population. So that's a pretty significant drop off, right? Less than 18 million compared to what it was before. Another sort of interesting thing to note is the smaller proportion of these working aged people. And again, demographers obviously assume that a large part of that is because of migration. So people left. And yep, Sunima, you're right. A lot of people also died in conflict, especially among men. It's assumed that quite a few of them bore the brunt of the conflict, right? They unfortunately died in the war. Now, what does it look like these days? So this was from 2020, last year. So as you can see, the population has not fully recovered. In fact, it's still a little bit lower than even what it was 5 years ago, although granted the drop is a little bit less steep than what it was from the period before. So the instability that remains in the country is probably still playing a pretty large role in population trends in that country, right? The civil war technically hasn't ended fully. There's still areas of the country that are under significant pressures from conflict. And so it's not entirely unsurprising that you would still see many families maybe choosing to delay pregnancies or still not having as many younger age children. But you are seeing some of the sort of working aged people bounce up again. So more than likely, as some people came back to the country right after they left through the war. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future and how this might impact, especially the economic growth of the country, now that it is a very young country again. So time will tell. Now, what does Canada's current population pyramid look like? That's ours. So what type of pyramid is this? Remind us again. Constrictive, yep. Yeah, so it is constrictive. We see some interesting sort of bumps in our population pyramid here. So especially among the baby boomers, but also individuals in kind of the late millennial age group. Now, there's a reason why Canada's population is not declining, even though our birth rate is small, even though our fertility rate is small. Does anyone know why that might be? Immigration, yeah, exactly. So Canada is not alone either. There's quite a few countries that have this sort of approach to maintaining their populations, and that includes places like Australia, Germany. So many of these types of countries, actively want to make sure that they don't experience something like labor shortages down the line. And so they really try to ensure that enough people are coming to the country to maintain that sort of base level of the population. So even though we don't have a very high birth rate, right, even though women here often choose to have smaller families, we are sort of combating these potential labor shortages that might come up by actively pursuing immigration. Now, this brings us to the demographic transition model. And so now that we've understood the sort of basic concepts behind population pyramids, population structures, why growth and decline happen, we can look at how those trends have evolved over time and how different countries are experiencing different trends simultaneously. So let's see what I mean by that. This is something that we call the demographic transition model. And so essentially it's a model that attempts to explain how different countries have transformed from having really high birth rates and death rates to lower birth rates and death rates over time. Not all countries have experienced all of the stages, and we'll kind of go through the stages one by one. But something noteworthy is that the stages of this model not only tell us something about the population, but also tell us quite a bit about the economic development from sort of pre-industrializing nations to more industrialized societies. So what I mean by that, let's take a look at this first stage, something that we call the high stationary stage. So you'll notice here the gray line and the black line. So this is the death rate and the birth rate on top of it. And they're nearly equal. They're both really high. And so this is most likely because of disease, because of famine, poor medical access, things like that. So because many children die, because there's high infant mortality, families are obviously opting to have many children as quickly as they can, sort of before the mortality rate kicks in. Now, currently in the world, there's very, very few societies that would fall under this category. Luckily, we don't really see it anymore because of the way that primarily medical advancements have sort of swept the globe. But there are still a few remote indigenous groups. I think there's one in Peru, especially, that sort of meets this criteria. But increasingly, this is really rare to find. So then we move on to the second stage of the model. This is called the early expanding stage. Now, what's interesting about this stage is that the birth rate is still really high, but this is where the mortality rate starts to drop off, and it drops off at a very rapid sort of exponential decrease. So why does this happen? Well, again, medical advancements. There's not as many children that are required because many more of them are surviving. So parents might not be so worried about making sure that they have a large family because their children are living past the age of childhood. Water supply and sanitation is probably also a factor that plays in there. And as you can imagine, because of this, there's a really, really large exponential increase in the total population because there's many, many more people that are being born than there are dying. Now, there's a few countries that are still under this sort of stage. They include places like Egypt, Kenya, but also Syria would have been one of them, right? Back in 2010, they sort of took on that expansive population pyramid. So their birth rate was really, really high, and the mortality was starting to decrease. Now, the third stage is something that we call the late expanding stage. So this is kind of characterized by the birth rate starting to decline, right? So that's different from the previous two stages. And that's a dramatic decrease. But what's less dramatic is the continuing ongoing decrease in mortality that kind of stagnates. So because of this, the population is still increasing, but the rate, the population growth rate, isn't as steep as the one prior. So why is this? Well, again, sort of the same trends that happened before: medical care, improved lifestyles as well. So better diets, things like that help to really elongate the life expectancy. So people are living much longer and aren't dying as quickly. Some examples of countries like that would include places like Brazil, as well as many other around the world. And then we come to this fourth stage, this low stationary stage. So this type is characterized by both low birth rates and low mortality rates. So low, in fact, that the population growth is really, really stable. It's increasing only at sort of a slight pace, definitely not experiencing any exponential growth. So it's a very slow, stable increase. And the main reasons for that are changes in society. So apart from all these sort of medical advancements that happen in earlier stages, there's much better family planning that takes into account in this stage, improving the status of women. So making sure that women are entering the workforce, they are awarded more equal opportunities, economic opportunities specifically. And so many of them are choosing to delay pregnancy or forego it completely, later marriages as well. So many, many sort of industrialized nations that we know of take on this type of stage. So places like Canada, the US, France as well. Now, Japan is unfortunately included here, but I think demographers would agree at this point in time that Japan is no longer really in this fourth stage. I guess when the author was looking at this almost 10 years ago now, they could still be sort of considered this fourth stage, but now we would probably include Japan here in this fifth stage. Now, the reason there's a question mark here is because when this model was originally conceptualized back in 1929, there really wasn't any example of a country being in this kind of fifth stage. So we're sort of in an unprecedented territory. Now, what happens in the fifth stage is that the population actually starts to decline because the birth rate is below the rate of mortality. So there's less babies being born than there are people dying, which results in an actual decline. So unless a country takes in something like immigration, then naturally a decline starts to happen. So this is what we see in places like Germany, although Germany is kind of actively tackling this now with a pretty strong immigration policy. But places like Japan, certainly, we would probably characterize as this fifth declining stage. So what you can take away from this demographic transition model is that it happens over time, right? These changes don't usually occur suddenly. Sometimes it can take numerous decades, even centuries, for societies to fully go from one stage to another. So, this doesn't happen overnight, and many countries certainly will hopefully experience these types of shifts in their demographic changes as the economic development follows in these societies. But again, it can usually take quite a bit of time for this transition to happen. Which leads us to a very unique example. So what happened in China is really unprecedented because they went through a few of those sort of population stages of the demographic transition in one generation. So that is completely unprecedented. Nowhere in the world is known to have experienced something quite to that level that China has. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's a couple of reasons why this sort of quick shift happened. One of them, of course, being the one-child policy that many of us were familiar with, although that ended technically in 2015. But so there's that. And there's as well this sort of really quick-paced economic shift that took place in China, which I think most demographers would agree sort of spearheaded this rapid pace that just wouldn't have been possible anywhere else, because everywhere else kind of experiences naturally a much more slower rate of these types of changes. So pre-1949, right? So sort of around the time of World War II, even before it, China was a very, very different place, as you might kind of imagine. So things like famines took place pretty regularly. There was a lot of sort of instability among the people who lived in China. There was a really large, what we call a peasant population. So people that were generally poor and rural, many of them were uneducated. And so the society looked just completely different in this period. So you could say that China found itself pre-1949 in that sort of high stationary stage, not quite, but maybe a late stage one. Now, what started to happen after that period, so we see the population pyramid here, is that China started to experience this kind of baby boom in the 60s, right? So we can see that reflected in their population pyramid, which is an expansive population pyramid, where we see this large proportion of children being born at the bottom of the pyramid. But notably, you might notice here this dip in 1959. Does anyone want to guess what might have happened there? So now that we know sort of the things that influence population change or decline, does anyone want to venture a guess what happened there? Why would the population suddenly decrease? So for context, this was sort of a early farming society in the 60s, right? They were experiencing rapid changes, socioeconomic changes. So what might have led to this sharp dip, this sudden mortality? Food lack. Yeah, change in government. Yeah, so mostly no food. There was a policy shift at this point in time in China where a lot of rural farmers were encouraged to go to factories, encouraged to contribute to society in a different kind of way, in a different sort of economy. So what happened was that many of these farmers stopped producing crops for people to consume, and there were large-scale food shortages. Yeah, there's a decrease in the 1960s as well. Yeah. So it's interesting to note that as economic development happened, there were maybe some instances that they didn't predict, right? That they maybe didn't think through fully. So you experience this sort of a period of population instability, right? Rapid sort of increase and decrease. Things were sort of changing at a very quick pace. So this actually led to that population decline for a period of about 5 years. But as you can see, then it sort of recovered in the 60s. This was mostly due to better economic sort of situation in the country. And so as people had incomes, they were surviving, there were more advancements, things like that. But of course, as you might notice, things started to decline a little bit. So let's take a look at the next stage. So China found itself in this sort of stage 3 that we would call. And this period of time, sort of the post 60s, so more into the 80s, early 2000s even, the population pyramid, as you can see, was not quite expansive, more constrictive, but something kind of sort of in between. So it was a period of big change in the particularly birth rates. So all of a sudden you saw many fewer children being born. And why might that be? Well, as you can guess, in 1980, sort of the main change that happened there was the population policy, the one-child policy that took place in 1980. So this had some pretty large-scale impacts on the population in China, as you might imagine. But something that's noteworthy is that there was this period of sort of allowing some families to still go on to have more than one child, right? Especially in rural parts of the country. One family could have one child. Yeah, exactly. So although that was the case certainly in urban areas, there was a period of time where the government was still allowing some more rural families and certainly some ethnic minorities to be exceptions to this rule. So that's why you still do see periodically some periods of sort of increase at this time, but certainly not at the rate that was seen before back in the 1960s. So what continued to happen was this rapid expansion of the economy. Things started to open up as well. And so there was a lot of labor, a lot of economic development, and many more women entering the workforce as well. So that obviously had consequences on the birth rate, which you can see reflected here throughout, especially the 1990s. Now, another thing sort of worth mentioning is that in addition to the one-child policy, right, and so experts kind of wonder what would have happened in China even without this policy, because as the economy was developing, as the economy was rapidly industrializing, many experts think that many families would have just chosen to not have as many children naturally, right? Maybe it wouldn't have been so strict, but they think that even so, without this policy, China would have naturally started to experience that kind of decline in the birth rate. But granted, the rate that that would happen at would have been nowhere near as quick as obviously with something so strict with a population policy like that. So let's take a look at what happened after that. So now we're more into the sort of current stage of 2015. So China is considered to be in almost that kind of stage 4 that we see, sort of that constrictive population pyramid. And demographers think that it may actually lead to a stationary population pyramid at some point as the years kind of go on and as those older age individuals start to die out naturally. So this is mostly due to the aging population, right? So even though the one-child policy ended effectively in 2015, because of the state of the economy, many families are still choosing to just naturally have those smaller families, right? Many women are in the workforce, they have a lot of opportunities, so there's no sense in them staying home to raise many children at home. In fact, it would be, detrimental to many of their incomes to kind of support larger families at this point. And so naturally, the population isn't likely to experience that kind of significant growth rate anymore, even though they no longer have this policy in place. Another thing worth mentioning is that, of course, contraception was really made available to families in order to make sure that they weren't exceeding that sort of one-child policy. And so naturally, as you offer families these types of options, they become more abundant and families just naturally start to decrease in size. So there's this question of what will happen with China in the future. Could it enter that sort of stage 5 question mark? In short, there's no reason why it wouldn't. China is unlikely to see this sort of large-scale immigration policy that many other countries are starting to look at in order to make sure that they don't enter that stage 5. So certainly it could happen if birth rates continue to be really low, that it might actually enter that stage 5 at some point in the future. So time will tell. And this will, of course, be determined by the economic development in the country that continues to expand at a really exponential rate, as well as just sort of societal family dynamics, right? So many people are still choosing to have very small families if they have children at all. And so this plays out in the population growth rate. Now, let's look at the demographic transition in Canada. So Canada's population pyramid is shifting. Granted, it's nowhere close to the rate that we just saw in China, so it's a much, much slower rate. But even so, it's worth noting some of the changes that have happened here. So this figure, the colored lines here denote what was going on in the 1970s, in 1971. So as you can see, Canada still had this sort of expansive population pyramid. This was mostly due to the baby boomer aged individuals having children at this period of time, right? So the people that were born in the post-war were now entering their sort of marriage and family planning time. And so that's why we saw this sort of boom in the number of children being born. But this already started to decrease by that point. So what happened next? Well, you can see here the black lines are what happened in 2016. So naturally, the population pyramid experienced this kind of constriction, the constrictive population pyramid here. And so the fertility rates dropped down, people were having less children, and that obviously had repercussions. But it's important to note that not all parts of Canada are the same. So even though these population pyramids kind of simplify what's going on at a national level, of course, there's other stories that could be told, especially in a place like Canada, which is not at all a homogenous society of one culture, of one type of people. There's many different sort of trends that are going on at the subnational level when you look at particular populations that make up this country. So we'll take a look at one quick example. This is the population pyramid for the Aboriginal Indigenous population here in Canada. So the blue sort of rectangles behind it are the regular general population, the non-Aboriginal population, and these yellow lines are what denotes the Aboriginal population. So as you can see, it's a pretty drastic and different change. What we see is a more expansive type of population pyramid, so something that we would characterize with a very rapid growth rate, right? Many children being born, many younger aged people in those demographic categories. Now, what kind of impacts does that start to have? Well, as you can see, they're experiencing this sort of population explosion, the Aboriginal population in Canada. So compared to what was going on sort of prior to the 1970s, where the growth rate was much, much slower, all of a sudden we're experiencing this sort of population boom. Now, it's not to say that even among First Nations or Indigenous populations that this is one trend that captures every First Nation out there. In fact, that's not at all the case. And when you break it down further to look at specific subgroups, whether that's First Nations, whether that's Inuit or Métis, there's actually some pretty significant differences there. So something that was noteworthy is that the Métis population is actually growing at a much significantly higher rate than some of those other Indigenous groups. Something also worth noting is that non-reserve Aboriginals are increasing at a much faster pace than the Indigenous groups that live on reserves. So hopefully this illustrates that as much as we like to simplify things when we look at something like a population pyramid, in fact, it does hide some of the equally important trends that are going on at smaller scales. But for many reasons, it might be a little bit impractical to create a series of population pyramids with many colors kind of superimposed on them. So we tend to try to simplify them in order to get the gist of the general trends going on. But I certainly wanted to highlight that there's other important things that are worth noting with these. So that's all we have for today. I hope that this served as a sort of introduction to population trends and population statistics. Certainly it's important to kind of get this stuff out of the way, because tomorrow we'll look at how those population trends actually impact diseases and how diseases impact those population trends. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to stop sharing here. And we finished a little bit early today. So if anyone has any questions, whether it's about your case study, about the assignment, feel free to let me know. I can certainly stick around for a couple of minutes. Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.